Hey there, and welcome. So today, we're going to dig into the basic rules of the game for our environment. It's this incredibly complex but beautiful system, right? And what you're about to see is just how everything is connected. I mean, everything, from the tiniest little microbe all the way up to the entire planet. All right, let's jump right in.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a question for you. How is a simple fish tank anything like planet Earth? I know, it sounds a little weird, but stick with me. That little glass box is actually a perfect, tiny version of the huge systems that keep our whole world ticking. It's a world in a bottle, and if you can figure out how it works, well, you're on your way to understanding our own.
But to really get that big picture, we've got to zoom in first. So let's step away from the aquarium for a second and look at the natural, self-contained worlds that are all around us. You know, like a backyard garden or even a small pond.
Yeah, and there's a name for these little worlds, an ecosystem. It's a really simple idea, but it's super powerful. It's just all the living stuff in one place interacting with each other, and with all the non-living stuff too. So a forest? That's an ecosystem. A lake? Yep, that's one too. And you guessed it, even that fish tank we just talked about, that's a man-made ecosystem.
So you can basically split any ecosystem into two main parts. First, you've got the biotic stuff. That's all the living things. We're talking plants, animals, all those tiny little microorganisms. Then, on the other side, you have the abiotic components, the non-living things. Think sunlight, temperature, rain, soil, wind, all of that. And the real magic, that happens when these two sides work together and create a perfect balance.
All right, now every single ecosystem, I don't care how big or small, it runs on energy. And the way that energy gets passed around from one creature to another, well, that's a system we've all heard of, the food chain.
So at the very bottom, the absolute foundation of everything, you have the producers. And 9 times out of 10, these are going to be green plants. They do something that's basically magic. It's called photosynthesis. They grab the sun's energy and literally turn it into food. They are the power plant for the whole system.
Okay, moving up a level, we've got the consumers. Pretty straightforward, right? These are the guys who can't make their own food, so they have to get their energy by eating other things. You've got your herbivores eating the plants, your carnivores eating other animals, and of course omnivores who kind of eat a bit of everything. But the key thing to remember is that they all, one way or another, rely on the energy that those producers captured in the first place.
And last but not least, we have the absolute unsung heroes of the ecosystem, the decomposers. Seriously, think of them as nature's ultimate cleanup and recycling crew. When plants and animals die, these tiny microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, they get to work. They break everything down and return all those essential nutrients right back to the soil. Why? So the producers can use them to start the whole cycle over again. Honestly, without these guys, the entire system would just stop.
So let's see how this all clicks together in a super simple food chain. You've got grass, that's our producer, soaking up the sun. Then a goat comes along, that's a primary consumer, and eats the grass. Then a human, a secondary consumer, might come along and eat the goat. See, it's a straight-up transfer of energy from one level, we call it a trophic level, to the next.
But, and this is where it gets really interesting, that energy transfer, it's not very efficient, not at all. In fact, there's a very simple but really important rule that explains just how much energy actually makes it from one level up to the next.
And that rule is the 10% rule.
Yeah, that's it. On average, only about 10% of the energy an organism eats actually gets turned into, well, more of that organism, and becomes available for the next predator. So it begs the question, right? Where in the world does the other 90% go?
Well, this pyramid explains it perfectly. A massive amount of that energy is lost at every single step. Most of it just becomes heat when the organism moves, breathes, digests its food, just lives its life. So as you can see, the amount of useful energy shrinks a lot as you go up from the producers at the bottom to the top consumers.
And here's the big takeaway from all this. That huge 90% energy loss at each step is exactly why food chains are almost never very long. They're usually only 4, maybe 5 steps tops. By that point, there's just not enough energy left on the table to support another level of predators. The numbers just don't add up.
Okay, so we've seen how these natural systems are, beautifully balanced. But what happens when we throw a wrench in the works? When we introduce something that just doesn't belong? Something that nature's awesome cleanup crew, the decomposers, just can't deal with? Well, that brings us to a huge problem in our modern world. Think about it. We use all sorts of chemicals, like pesticides, to help our crops grow. But a lot of them are non-degradable,
which is just a fancy way of saying they don't break down. They stick around. So what happens when those get into the food chain?
It kicks off this really dangerous process called biological magnification. It's a wild idea. Remember how energy decreases as you go up the food chain? Well, the concentration of these harmful chemicals does the complete opposite. It actually gets stronger. It magnifies at every single level.
Let's just trace how this works for a second. A plant might soak up a tiny amount of pesticide from the soil. Then, a goat comes along and eats a whole bunch of those plants, right? So all those tiny bits of toxin build up in its body. Then, a wolf might eat a bunch of those goats, and that concentrates the toxin even more. And since we humans are often at the top of our food chains, guess who can end up with the highest, most dangerous levels of these chemicals? Yeah, us.
So this all leads us to the really big picture. What we do doesn't just affect the local pond or forest. Our actions have a global footprint. And that creates these massive, planet-wide challenges, like figuring out what to do with all our trash and dealing with damage to our atmosphere.
The trash we make pretty much falls into two buckets. First, there's biodegradable stuff, like food scraps or paper. Nature's decomposers can handle that no problem. They break it down and it gets recycled. But then there's the non-biodegradable waste, and the biggest one here is plastic. Our little decomposer friends just can't break it down, so it just sits there. It persists, piling up in the environment for hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years.
And our impact isn't just on the ground either. Way up in the atmosphere, we have the ozone layer. You can think of it like Earth's shield or its sunscreen. It's absolutely vital for life because it protects all of us from the sun's most harmful ultraviolet or UV rays. So how does it work? Well, ozone, or O3, gets made naturally. High-energy UV light from the sun zaps a regular oxygen molecule, which is O2. That blast of energy splits the O2 into two separate oxygen atoms. Then, those free atoms hook up with other O2 molecules, and boom, you get O3, ozone. It's this constant, natural protective cycle. But in the last century, we started pumping out these man-made chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs for short. They were in everything from refrigerators to spray cans. And what happened was, these CFCs floated up into the atmosphere and just started wrecking ozone molecules way faster than nature could make new ones. This created a huge, dangerous hole in the ozone layer. The good news is, the world noticed this back in the 80s, got together and agreed to ban these chemicals, and is actually one of our biggest environmental success stories.
And all of this brings us to one last, really important thought. When you look at nature, from the perfect recycling system of the decomposers to that flow of energy, you realize something. Natural systems are incredibly efficient. In a healthy ecosystem, there's really no such thing as waste. Everything gets used. Which kind of leaves us with a big question to chew on, doesn't it? If nature wastes nothing, how can we learn to do the same?